Welcome to the Academic Writing Amplified podcast. On this podcast, we believe that the culture of academia needs to change radically. Women and non-binary people are revolutionizing academia within institutions that were not built for us. If you're ready to reject the culture of overwork, kick guilt and overwhelm to the curb, and amplify your voice to make a real impact on your field without breaking down or burning out, you're in the right place. With our team of experienced writing coaches as co-hosts, we'll share insights and talk to inspiring guests to bring you the practical strategies, systems, and mindset shifts you need to find time to write, publish work you love, and design your career on your terms. And it all starts with writing. Let's go. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Academic Writing Amplified podcast. I'm your host, Kathy Mazak from Scholar's Voice, and I'm so glad that you are joining us today as we continue our podcast series about emotions and writing. And the emotion that we're talking about today is motivation. So many of you will tell me, or I'll hear, like, I'm just not motivated to write. Sometimes it's project specific, right? I'm not motivated to work on this project. What can I do? So that is what today's episode is about. So as I mentioned, this is part of a series all about emotions and writing. So if you're just finding the podcast, welcome. Thank you for listening. You can scroll back in the podcast feed and you will see our whole series. We're kind of right in the middle of it. It's a longish series because there's a lot to say about emotions and writing. So, motivation. So let's talk about this idea of like feeling motivated. This has a lot of, oh my gosh, I was going to say garbage, which is probably the right word. But what I meant to say was actually baggage. Like motivation has a lot of baggage hooked to it. So a lot of times, like our pop notion of psychology and motivation is that there are two kinds of motivation, right? Intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation comes from within and is kind of like your desire to do a thing or act a certain way. Extrinsic motivation is put on you from somebody else or some other forces or some circumstances. And that's what motivates you to do the thing. So an analogy that I like to use a lot when I'm thinking about writing, and especially emotions around writing and these kinds of things like motivation, an analogy I like to use is exercise, right? So the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation for exercise might be that maybe you get some kind of diagnosis, or you kind of realize maybe somebody in your family gets a diagnosis that compels you to start or continue or do a certain kind of exercise. For example, definitely an extrinsic motivation for me for exercise is a history of heart conditions, especially in my maternal line. So I want to make sure that I'm doing exercise. One of my motivations for doing exercise is to have a healthy heart, because I know that I have a family history of heart disease. All right. Intrinsic motivation, though, is triggered from within. So I will tell you that almost never do I wake up in the morning and I say, I can't wait to exercise. I have very little internal or intrinsic motivation for exercise. It usually, for example, I got COVID this summer, and so I was out for the count for 2-3 weeks. I had zero energy. And on the other side of that, there was definitely kind of a pull to move my body, because I had literally spent a good 7 days in bed and then an extra at least 2 weeks just feeling so tired that there was I would say there was a little spark inside that made me want to move my body when I finally felt better. But usually I walk around having zero intrinsic motivation to exercise. Other people feel differently. Other people love to run, like it's what gets them thinking and that kind of thing, or they love to lift weights. I actually like to lift weights while I'm doing it. And when I've done it, I'm like, yes, that felt great. But getting myself to do it is something that I cannot rely on intrinsic motivation for that. And that is the key. That's where I'm going with this analogy, is that when it comes to exercise, many people, like, you need to do it and you can't rely on internal motivation in order to make it happen. And so that might be something, though, that you haven't, that line of thinking might be something that you haven't transferred over into the world of writing. Instead, again, a pop psychology or a pop notion of writing and like creative work, painting, like that kind of thing, is that you need inspiration, you need kind of motivation to do it, right? So I want to talk about that idea that we need motivation to write. Again, I think it's a pop idea, like a popular idea, or it's like out there in the universe, that writing needs internal or intrinsic motivation. I actually don't think that's true. I think that that comes from thinking about writing as creative writers think about writing. Maybe. I mean, I don't think this is true for creative writers either. But the popular notion, right, is that like, oh, I got inspired by the blade of grass and I wrote a poem about it. But that's actually not how most creative writers work. And it does not hold for academic writing at all. So if it doesn't hold for creative writers that you need motivation or inspiration, it really doesn't hold for academic writers. But there's this like popular notion out there, or there's kind of cultural, I guess, notion that works of creation need kind of internal motivation. Not true. Not true. And so instead, what you need instead of motivation, so if you're feeling, again, this is a series about emotions, right? So if you're feeling a lack of motivation, what you really need are systems and processes. So having said that, I want to back up and I want you to check a couple of other things before we get to the systems and processes. So just like exercise, just like I can't rely on my internal motivation to exercise every day, I need something else to help me to do it. So I need systems, processes, I need tools. For exercise, a couple of things work for me. One is going to a personal trainer. Actually, I have a personal trainer who I love, who is a friend as well, like has become a friend, over our work together. We talk about all kinds of things, like we have similar aged kids, a lot in common. And so what gets me motivated to go work out is seeing her. And also knowing that I've basically outsourced all the decision making about the exercise. I just have to go, show up, and she leads me through it, right? So that is something that works for me. For other people, right, going to a gym where they see the same people all the time, that can help you get that motivation to go. Another thing, my trainer actually is moving to Spain, so I have to figure out how I'm going to do this myself. And one thing that does help me is to have the weights like someplace that I can see them, so that if I can't go to my trainer, then at least, I see the weights there. My yoga mat is right there. My weights are right there. So it's really easy. It takes like taking obstacles down to doing the exercise. For writing, parallels might be having a writing date with a friend, either virtually or in person. I call that co-writing, right? Like where you get on a Zoom together and you write together. Having the tools for writing around you, have the environment for writing set up around you. And then having these systems and processes that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So let's talk about a couple things to check before you jump to systems and processes. So if you're feeling a lack of motivation around a particular writing project or writing in general, the very first thing I want you to check is your level of rest. How full is your battery, basically? Sorry, just as an aside, I realize I do not like using metaphors that relate humans to machines. And I'm aware of this, and yet I do it anyway, right? I just did it with the battery comment. So erase. Erase that comment. You don't have to erase it from the podcast, but erase it from your mind. We don't have batteries, but let's use the analogy like a cup full. How full is your resting and recuperation cup? Most of you are rolling your eyes right now and being like, well, it's not full at all. I'm exhausted. So the first place to look when you're trying to search for motivation and you're trying to have motivation be like a feeling that comes from within you. I mean, I'm going to tell you all the ways that you need to work around that. But also, no motivation is coming to you if you're exhausted. Okay, so if you're waiting for certain feelings to happen or something, another thing to check is your level of exhaustion and just getting some rest. All right. The other thing I want you to check before we talk about the systems and processes that will kind of override that need for motivation, I do want you to check your emotions, your feelings that the certain project that you don't have motivation for is triggering. So for example, maybe you're feeling a lack of motivation around a project because you're starting to doubt its relevancy. Maybe it's been sitting so long on your hard drive that you don't have that same belief that it's going to make a contribution in the way that you want it to. Things like that. I want you to do a check around what are you, again, that question that I introduced about procrastination. What are you avoiding feeling? But I guess if you're feeling a lack of motivation, I would rephrase the question to say, what is thinking about doing that project making you feel? If it's hopeless, if it's tired, if you're feeling like you're behind, all of those things are going to affect your kind of intrinsic motivation for the project. Similarly, if you have a co-author and you've disappointed that co-author and that's why you don't want to work on the project, or the opposite, the co-author has disappointed you and so you don't want to work on the project. The big idea of all of these podcast episodes about emotions and writing are that you have to deal with the emotional part. You can't skip it. Okay, so don't skip reflection on the emotional part of writing and what is causing the lack of motivation. Don't skip rest, because it's really hard to get motivation to do things if you're completely exhausted. And now I'm going to talk about how, instead of relying on intrinsic or internal motivation, or even external motivation like due dates and deadlines, I want you instead to rely on systems and processes. Okay? So if you're feeling a lack of motivation, maybe you just aren't going to be motivated to work on the project. We can't, I think it's inhumane to expect that you are going to have the motivation with all the other things that you're doing and everything to yay, let's work on this article that's been sitting around for a long time, right? So instead of berating yourself for not having motivation or thinking you are not a good academic or not a good scholar because you don't have intrinsic motivation to get your writing project done. Instead, let's build systems and processes and workflows to help you create the situation, make it easier for you. Just like I said with having the weights where I can see them, just make it easier for you to pick up that weight and do 3 sets of 10, right? That's the kind of situation that we want for our writing, and how we can use systems and processes. We can lean on systems and processes when we can't guarantee motivation or when we're feeling a lack of motivation. So here's some ideas. First, You have a publication pipeline mapped out. So you know, in your grand scheme of writing projects, you know where the project that you want to work on fits. You know its importance, you know its distance to done or distance to submit. When we map out the publication pipeline and navigate, you create these kind of stages. You know what stage the project's at. That's the big picture. You know where the project fits into the big picture. If you have that system set up, then that is something that can help you so that you don't have to rely on motivation. You're like, okay, I know where this project is. I know how far it is to done. I know its importance. That's another thing that is key. Then for the project, you also have a list, like you have broken the project down into tasks, and you have identified writing problems that you need to tackle before you can get to the tasks or before more parts of the article or the piece of writing can become tasks. Again, this is the difference between writing problems and writing tasks is something that I teach inside of Navigate. It's a way to really, you take a different project management approach to writing tasks than you do to writing problems. So if you have that distinction clear, and you also have identified, okay, what writing problem do I need to solve next in this thing that I'm working on? And then what are some tasks that I could work on while I'm solving that writing problem? Or you've come up with basically what I call that is like your project management plan for the article or the piece of writing, the chapter of the book or whatever. So you have that. That's a system. You know the difference between problems and tasks. You know how long it takes you to complete tasks. You know the project management approach to problems versus the project management approach to tasks. That is going to help you go a long way to overcoming lack of motivation. And then other things too, like you need to have scheduled time as an appointment on your calendar for writing. And this is something that consistency. Now, you all know, if you've been listening for a while, I'm not talking about everyday writing. I'm talking about 1 to 2 hours once or twice a week to begin. That you have them marked on your calendar and that they are honored as appointments and that you are doing that consistently. We know you're human, things happen, you get derailed, but that is always what you're coming back to, that once or twice a week, 1 or 2 hours at a time. So you have that, you're getting consistency. Again, when I teach the soaring system inside of the Navigate program, this is something we work on a lot, or we figure out how you're going to do, right? Because if you are consistently letting your writing time get bowled over by other things, other people's fires, other problems, then it's an additional layer of lack of motivation because you're, again, like you can berate yourself, like, why can't I keep these appointments? Why am I not finding time to write? Well, it's just an additional thing to make you feel a lack of motivation. We don't want that. Another thing to think about is your writing setup, right? Your physical area where you write. What kinds of tools do you need to have around you? For example, like the last time you wrote in the document, did you leave yourself some breadcrumbs about what you're going to work on next? Do you need to have a certain notebook or pieces of data available to you? Like, are you set up to do the writing? Because if you have all your tools in place, again, it's like having the weights and the yoga mat nearby. It's easier to just pull them out and do the exercise. If you have the tools that you know you're going to need for the writing, if you have them kind of at the ready. There's lots of ways to do this. One way that I really like, because I'm a Google Docs person, and the Google Suite is how I manage my writing. And I just do, like in Chrome, I do on the bookmarks bar, I do a folder, and I have a folder for the current writing project that I'm working on. So that right from the bookmarks bar, like super easy, I can just jump to the files that I need right there. So think about that. For a project that you're working on, how can you set up your workspace either physically around your computer or virtually on your computer so that you have what you need at the ready? Thinking that you need to wait for motivation to compel you to write is just approaching your writing wrong. And I don't usually like to just say it that blatantly, but it's true. Not even creative writers, poets do not sit around waiting for inspiration to hit them. That's not actually how artists work. So if you're using that analogy, or you're thinking that, well, writing is creative, it is. And so I have to wait, I need to be motivated to do it. Writing is more like exercise than it is like this idealized notion of creative person who gets kind of a lightning bolt idea and then creates the novel or the poem. Like, that is not how novelists or poets work either. They have systems and processes. They do way more writing and reading than just the moment of crafting the first draft of a poem. There's much more behind the scenes, and it is the same way for academic writing. I'm not saying to dismiss your feelings about the lack of motivation that you're having, but what I am saying is that if you're waiting around for motivation, you will be waiting a long time. So instead, what I suggest you do are the two things I told you before about things to check. One is about rest. Of course, you're going to feel a lack of motivation if you're exhausted. So double check your rest. The second thing is, what are the emotions that are causing that lack of motivation? What are your feelings around the project? What are maybe feelings that the lack of motivation is almost trying to save you from feeling something when you go to work on the project? So what is it, that lack of motivation, that your brain is trying to save you from feeling? And then finally, what are the systems and tools that you're using so that you're making your writing, you're teeing things up for yourself so that you are ready to go when you sit down to write? Or if you would like more, I hope that I'm inspiring on this podcast. If you would like more inspiration from the podcast, please subscribe. If you would like more systems and tools and project management, I teach that inside of my Navigate program. You can go to scholarsvoice.org/navigate to get on the wait list for our next cohort. But meanwhile, subscribe to this podcast. Share this podcast series with a friend who you think would need it, a colleague who you think would enjoy a listen. And if you came here because someone referred you to the podcast, if you go to scholarsvoice.org and scroll to the bottom of almost any page, you will find a place where you can get on the In the Pipeline newsletter email list. And that is where I send you weekly writing advice and publication updates, as well as notifications when new podcast episodes come out. All right. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for listening. Bye.
Thank you so much for spending your valuable time supporting yourself and your writing by listening to this episode. If you like what you heard today, the best way to say thank you is to hop on over to Apple iTunes and write an honest review. The more reviews, the more amazing academic women and non-binary people will find this podcast. So go write one now.